Testing, testing. Okay. Zoop. Hello. Sorry, I'm just trying a bit of a new setup. I've got in-ear monitors, which probably will make balancing sounds a bit easier. But the unfortunate corollary of it is I have to hear my voice on a weird delay, just ever so slightly. I think we're alright though. Music track's probably going to get a bit... I only have the one. I could find some more. Yeah, let's just quickly... I think we're all good. I think we are all good. So, hi, hello. Thank you for joining me. We're going to be doing something a bit different today. A little bit unusual. Possibly not so unusual, depending on whose streams you watch already. But we're going to be doing some reading. Had I thought about it a little bit harder, or had I had time during the day, unfortunately, having a day job really gets in the way of streaming as a hobby, doesn't it? I would have found the text online, posted a link to it, and then you could read along at home. But might not be too late. Might not be too late. Let me see what I can find. No, I think the specific book that I've selected, because this is, although this is folk stories, I have chosen a specific collection to read to you from. I could have done it online, but I just... There's something wonderful about the feel of books. This is a nice one. This is a nice book. Haven't picked out anything specific yet, so I think I'll just sort of go through the contents, read out the titles of the stories, and see what appeals to me. Let's see what you got. Now, a lot of these are very short, so I'll probably get through a few of them this evening. We've got fairies, haunted houses, witchcraft, monsters, merfolk. It's interesting that this book used the word merfolk. I thought that was a sort of more modern coinage. The Highland vision, miscellaneous tales. I do like miscellany. Why don't I do sort of one from each, and then we'll see where we go. I'd like to start with a slightly longer one. They're only a page or two each. Let's do this one. Just open to a random page. Oh, excuse me. I'm just going to take a sip of water. Might seem like I'm procrastinating, putting off actually getting started with the story, but just gonna have a sip of water. Make sure my throat doesn't get too dried out while we're going. Okay, are we all sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin. The first story we're going to be reading tonight is Duncan, Fraser and the Fairies. Many years ago, on a farm in a remote part of Sutherland, there was employed a man named Duncan Fraser. One day he was sent by his master to cut peats on a piece of moorland, at one end of which was a little hillock known as the Fairy Mound. The man set to work with a will, and soon had cut quite a number of peats. Suddenly he heard a voice exclaiming, "Put back that turf on the roof of my house at once." Looking up in fright, he saw the tiny figure of a woman dressed in green, with long golden hair hanging loosely round her shoulders. Duncan had heard of the she, and knew what harm they could work on mortals who offended them, so he hastened to replace the divots which must have formed the roof of a fairy dwelling. When he looked round, the strange figure had vanished, and he hurried homewards to tell the story to his master, and to beg him to have the peats cut from another part of the moor. The farmer laughed at the tale, declaring that he had no belief in fairies, and ordered Duncan to go back at once and lift all the peats. The man did as he was told, in fear and trembling, and was surprised and relieved to find that he was left unmolested. Months passed, till autumn came again, and Duncan had almost forgotten the adventure. On the very day on which the peats had been lifted the year before, he left the farm to go to his cottage, carrying with him a can of milk for his wife. His way lay by the fairy mound, and when he reached it he felt so tired that he sat down to rest, and soon fell asleep. When he awoke, the moon was shining brightly and round. When he awoke, the moon was shining brightly, and round about him was dancing a band of fairies, singing and laughing. They seized his hands, and soon he found himself dancing and laughing with the elfin crowd. The revelry went on all through the night. Then came the sound of a cock crowing in the farmyard, and the fairy band rushed towards the mound, dragging Duncan with them. A door opened, shutting again with a bang as soon as the fairies entered. The little folk sank down exhausted, and poor bewildered Duncan sat on a piece of rock, wondering what was to happen next. Even when the fairies awoke and began to move about, he still sat on in a kind of daze, making no attempt to get away. At last, someone tapped his hand, and he saw in front of him the little woman in the green dress, who a year ago had ordered him to replace the turf. "Once more," she said, "the grass has grown over my roof. Go home, but swear never to speak of what you have seen here." Duncan gladly gave his oath of silence, and he was allowed to leave the fairy dwelling. He found his can of milk where he had left it, as he thought, the night before, and set off joyfully for home. A great surprise awaited him. His children were now well grown, and looking on him as a stranger, while his wife stared as if she saw a ghost. When convinced that he was indeed her husband, she reproached him for deserting her, and then Duncan knew that he had been in fairyland for 7 whole years while he worked out the punishment laid on him by the wee folk. There we are. It's quite a nice one. You know, bit of an unhappy ending, but can't really be helped. You know, you annoy the fairies, you're going to get what's coming to you. Okay, let's pick another one. Let's see what's in section 2. Shall we? Haunted houses. Oh, this one looks a bit longer. Appointment at Ticonderoga. I might not be pronouncing that right. Early in the 18th century, at a ford on a river near Balachron Castle in Argyll, Stewart of Appin suddenly came face to face with his old enemy, Donald Campbell. Both men drew their dirks, and there was a bitter fight to the death. At last, Stewart stood, wiping his blade on the grass as the body of the Campbell floated away downstream. Knowing that within a matter of hours the clan Campbell would be out for his blood, Stewart decided to rely upon the ancient law of Highland hospitality, whereby any man, no matter what crime he had committed, could always count himself safe when being entertained under the roof of a Highland home. With an ironic smile, he set off, and a little while later was knocking on the door of Inverore House. the home of Duncan Campbell of Inverore, the brother of the man he had murdered. In all innocence, Campbell invited him in and gave him the hospitality of his house. That night, Campbell awoke in the small hours to see, with horror and alarm, the pale, blood-stained figure of his brother standing at the foot of the bed. "You are sheltering my murderer," said the spectre. "I insist upon revenge." Campbell turned the matter over and over in his head, but could not bring himself to violate the time-honoured code of hospitality. Upon 3 successive nights, the ghost stood at his bedside, and before finally vanishing, it raised its hand and with great emphasis and reproach uttered the words, never before heard in Inverore House, nor indeed in all Argyle, "Meet me in Ticonderoga." The injunction meant nothing to Duncan Campbell. Soon after the safe departure from his house of Stewart of Appin, Campbell himself left to join the 42nd Highland Regiment, the Black Watch, with which he fought in France. Years later, the Black Watch was sent to America, and there they were posted to a place lying between the states of New York and Vermont, a fort occupied by the French and called by the Indians Ticonderoga. On the 17th of July, 1758, the Black Watch attacked, and Duncan Campbell of Inverore kept his appointment made years before in Scotland by the sinister figure at the foot of his bed. The same night, in Inverore House, a little boy awoke in a great fright to see a tall Highlander bending over the bed in which his father slept. In the morning he mentioned it to his father, who deduced that the visitor had been their kinsman Duncan Campbell, come to tell them of his death in America. It is said in the neighbourhood that the ghost of Inverore House is not yet at rest. Local people say it can often be seen, a tall, handsome figure in the Highland uniform of 2 centuries ago, silently pacing the interior of the now ruined house. I do love a good haunted house story. Right. What should we look at next? Oh, here's one. This one's called The Vampire Filar. The following strange story was told to me some years ago by an old worthy of Stralach, Perthshire. An old bothy near Filar, between Athol and the Braemar country, used to afford a welcome night's rest to weary travellers in the bleak and rugged district which surrounds it. When left unoccupied, it was often used by poachers. Around the year 1923, 2 poachers arrived in Filar one winter's night, after a successful foray, and, finding the bothy door locked, broke a window in order to gain entrance. Once inside, they kindled a fire, but found that they had no water to cook a meal. One of them volunteered to go for some, and as the only exit was through the window, he put one leg over the sill. While in this position, he began to scream and called to his companion that some fiend had got hold of his leg and was tearing it and sucking his blood. After a violent struggle, he managed to extricate himself and gained the ground, still in great terror and pain. On searching the ground round the bothy, he could find no trace of any living thing, but saw in the distance white-winged objects and faint blue lights which kept changing their position in the darkness. With difficulty, he collected the water with all speed, but did not dare to return through the window, and, with the help of his friend, broke down the door. The 2 men spent the night in the state of fear. Next morning, they could find no trace of man nor beast. Their own footprints alone were visible. The man bore the mark of this injury all his life, and it is believed that the unusual and unaccountable occurrence prevented any poachers from taking up residence at Filar in after times. It is said by some of the older inhabitants of the neighbourhood that the bothy has, to this date, the evil reputation of being haunted by the Vampire of Filar. Ooh. Short but sweet. Let's see what else we got. Do you like this book? Just gonna sit back in my chair a bit. Okay. Let's see what's in the... Let's go for this one. The Three Witches of Kingtail. A story of Loch Ness, West Rossshire, as told by Rory Moore of Ullapool. As told by Jackson Muir of ENVtuber. Long ago, in the village of Kingtail, on the shores of Loch Ness in West Rossshire, there lived a ship's carpenter called Willie. Now, Willie's own dinghy needed mending, but neither in his workshop nor in the village could he find the right piece of wood. So Willie started off to the woods. For many hours the carpenter wandered and searched among the pine trees. How long he walked before he realised that he was lost, Willie did not know, but daylight was fading. Daylight was fading and the woods were wrapped in the damp greyness of the mist. On and on he went, always, as he thought, in the direction of Kingtail. At nearly every step the track became more hazardous and the visibility became worse than ever, until suddenly he saw a faint glimmer of light winking through the fog. When he got closer he found that the light was emanating from a cottage window. Groping his way to the door, Willie knocked loudly. From inside there came the sound of shuffling feet. Slowly the door opened to reveal an old woman. She did not speak, so Willie explained his plight, and only then did she bid him enter. Now Willie, who had been born and bred in the district and had lived all his life in Kingtail, thought it rather strange that he neither recognised the aged lady nor remembered ever having seen the cottage before, and it was a feeling of wonderment that he followed her into the kitchen, thanking her for her Highland hospitality. Imagine his surprise when he found that there were two even older ladies seated, one at each side of the peat fire. He had never seen them before either. The first told Willie briefly that the other two were her sisters, and, after introducing him, invited the now bewildered carpenter to dine with them, and, since he was very hungry, he accepted gladly and willingly took a dram. Feeling rather better after the meal, Willie decided to agree to the sisters' suggestion that he should spend the night with them, since the mist, which lingered thickly outside, was still pressing against the cottage window. He was shown to his room, a small one which contained, among other articles of furniture, a bed, a table, a chair, and a large old-fashioned wooden box opposite the fireplace. The atmosphere of the place felt queer and even sinister. He began to wish that he had never entered the cottage, and, for a moment, thought of leaving at once, but he was so tired that he lay down and soon fell asleep. Willie slept soundly and did not hear the door open, nor did he hear the shuffle of the first sister's slippers as she crossed the room. He woke with a start only with the creaking of hinges long rusty, and saw her lit by the glow from the smouldering peat fire. She was bending over the old wooden trunk at the foot of his bed, and she looked like a witch. Willie stayed very still and watched. The old hag searched for a while in the wooden box, and then stood up. In her hand she held a small red cap. Carefully she placed it upon her head, and slowly she uttered the strangest words. "He is off to London," she said. And the next moment she had disappeared up the chimney, and Willie lay gasping with surprise and fright. Hardly had he begun to recover a little, when in shuffled a second sister, and, going over to the trunk, she too took out a small red bonnet which she placed on her head, and she too lifted her right arm and muttered the same words, "He is off to London," and immediately vanished after her sister. Not more than a minute later, to his amazement, entered the third sister, and she too took out a small red cap, and in like manner was spirited away up the chimney. Willie lay in a state of nervous bewilderment for a while, and wondered what on earth to do. He pinched himself hard to see if he really was awake and not dreaming these strange happenings. Then he decided the best thing to do would be to get out of bed and search the house, so he crept very quietly out of the bedroom and into the kitchen. But there was no one about, and he found on closer investigation that he was entirely alone in the cottage. Willie returned to the bedroom and decided to have a look inside the trunk. There was nothing inside it but one small red cap. He lifted it out rather carefully and examined it, but it appeared to be a perfectly ordinary bonnet, so he placed it on his head. And then Willie did a very stupid thing. He was suddenly possessed by a strong feeling of curiosity, and, rather timidly, let it be said, he too raised his right hand and uttered the words, "He is off to London." No sooner had he done so than, to his astonishment, he immediately found himself walking down Bow Street in London City. This was the London of Samuel Pepys, the London of coffee and alehouses and cobblestones, and it was into an alehouse that Willie turned, and it was strange that he felt no alarm at finding himself in town, when all his life had been spent in faraway Scotland. But in he went, and imagine his amazement at finding the three older sisters sitting round a table drinking whisky. They invited him over to join them in refreshment without showing the slightest surprise. After the 4 visitors had consumed their drinks, they sat for a little while, watching the men of fashion who drifted in. It seemed to Willie rather strange that they were not astonished to see 3 such ancient witches sitting in their alehouse, but no one appeared to notice anything odd about the Highlanders. After standing each other a few more drams, the first sister put on the little red cap which she had taken off on arriving in London, and this time it was her left arm which she raised before she mumbled, "Here's off back to Kingtail," and vanished through the smoke-blackened oak beams. Then the second sister put on her red bonnet and vanished after the first. Then the third sister followed her partners, leaving Willie alone at the table. He sat there, thinking of the mystery of it all, and had also just decided to return to Kingtail, when a waiter came up to him and presented him with the bill for the drinks. Of course, Willie had no money, so the waiter called in the manager, who sent for the police, and when Willie told them his story, they arrested him at once on charge of witchcraft. So poor Willie was flung into prison, and eventually he was tried and found guilty, having no feasible defence to offer. And since the penalty for his crime at that time in England was death by hanging, he was sentenced to that fate. On the day of his execution, the miserable carpenter was removed from his London prison to Hampstead. He was forced onto the scaffold, and the rope was fastened around his neck. "Have you anything to confess?" they asked. But Willie answered, "No." "Is there anything you wish to do or say before you meet your doom?" he was asked. But Willie shook his head. Then, all of a sudden, he had a great idea. "Yes," said Willie, "I have one small request to make, and it is this. Before you hang me, might I put on this small red cap I have in my pocket?" He was told that there was no reason why he should not, so he carefully put on the red bonnet. The huge crowd which had gathered to watch his execution saw him raise his left arm, and they heard him shout out, "Here's off back to Kingtail," and before their unbelieving gaze he vanished from their sight. And Willie? Well, he found himself back in his own workshop on the shores of Loch Ness, not only with the rope still around his neck, but with a whole gallows plank as well. And so there he was, back in Kingtail, with the very piece of wood for which he had been looking for the stem of his boat, when he started off on his amazing adventure. It was just exactly what he required to make his boat seaworthy, and the rope made a good anchor cord. In some strange way, Willie had great luck in his reconstructed vessel, for he caught more fish on the first occasion he set sail on the loch than he had ever caught before in one day, and to this day the miracle of the fishes still remains the unsolved mystery of Kingtail. Willie returned to the woods to search for the cottage, but he never found it, nor its weird inhabitants. They had completely disappeared. All that remained was his good luck. So he who wishes to make a good catch of fish on Loch Ness will wear a red cap or have a red touree on his Highland bonnet. And you who have heard the legend of Willie the Carpenter and the 3 witches of Kingtail know why. I like that one. One of the things I do enjoy about folk stories is they're sort of they're bite-sized, you know? They got just enough to satisfy your thirst for knowledge. Okay, so let's move on to chapter 3. Chapter 4. We've done chapter 3. Chapter 3 was the witches. I think, yeah. Book 4 is monsters. Okay. Oh, well, we might as well start off with the Loch Ness monster. You know, the famous one. Loch Ness is often referred to as the Queer Loch on account of the legends regarding its monster, which through ages is supposed to have disported itself on the surface of the water on calm days. In fact, there seems to be more in the story of the Loch Ness monster than mere imagination. Sorry, I just need to adjust something really quick. Sorry, it was just too loud in my own ears. Right. In the life of St. Columba, a great beast is described in the River Ness. As St. Columba lived in the early part of the 6th century, this means that the Loch Ness monster is probably 14 centuries old. The 9th abbot, Adamnan, in his book on St. Columba, written in AD 670, tells how the saint was once crossing the River Ness when he saw some of the inhabitants burying an unfortunate man who had been seized by while swimming by the monster and so horribly mutilated that he was dead before his friends could pull him out of the water. St. Columba, on hearing this, ordered one of his companions to swim across the loch. He did so, and the monster, scenting further prey, rose again to the surface. The holy man then raised his right hand and, making the sign of the cross in the air, invoked the monster in the name of God to go with all speed. The beast was so terrified at the voice of the saint that it sank instantaneously to its lair, and the swimmer returned unharmed to the shore. Another legend of later years tells how a tinker and his dog took refuge one cold autumn night in a cave in the rocks below Balachron, on the shores of the loch. As the wind was chill, the tinker placed some pieces of brushwood across the mouth of the cavern in order to seal his humble dwelling from the icy blast. After cooking his supper, the tinker was resting with his dog by the fire when the dog started to growl. On removing the brushwood, the tinker saw a huge monster with fiery eyes and a long black body. His dog immediately rushed at it and engaged it in battle. A long fight ensued, until finally the monster dashed towards the loch and plunged into its depth, with an unearthly snarl, the dog fastening onto it as he sprang. Long did the tinker wait, but his dog never returned. On certain calm days, so the story goes, the surface of the loch is said to be violently troubled due to the continued fight between the monster and the dog, as they rise up to the surface, each struggling incessantly to loose the other's grip. When we pass from fiction to facts, as authenticated by contemporary newspaper reports, it is hard to discredit the existence of a strange creature in the waters of Loch Ness. One eyewitness who saw it one February afternoon, 1932, described it as being from 6 to 8 feet long. Other observers have said 30 to 40 feet, with a broad, humped back and swan-like neck, and a small head with a jaw filled with rounded teeth. This observer described the monster as paddling slowly up against the current, which was running very swiftly, as the River Ness was in heavy spate at the time. One man viewed the monster as it was crossing the main road between Doris and Foyers. Doris and Foyers. He narrated that it had a long neck, which first came into sight as it crossed the highway, followed by a bulky body, but he could see no tail. The creature appeared to be carrying a lamb or a small deer on its back and moved with a jerky motion. Another person declared that he was taken aback by seeing a huge beast for all the world like a camel as he left the Doris Inn, appearing through the foliage on the east side of the main road as it was growing dark. He said he saw it waddle across the road and down the banks in the direction of the loch, where he lost sight of it in the trees, but he distinctly heard a great splash coming from the direction of the water shortly afterwards. Other witnesses have described a serpentine head and neck protruding above the surface of the loch. On one occasion, the monster was observed for 40 minutes through powerful field glasses as it lay basking on the surface of the loch, and 8 separate humps were counted on its back. The late Sheriff Watt of Drumbuie, Drumnadrochit, emphatically stated that he saw the monster on several occasions while fishing in the loch. The spoor of the four-toed amphibian, discovered on the southern shore of the loch, reproduced in the Daily Mail, was believed to be that of the monster. With new evidence continually flooding in from sources that are unimpeachable, it becomes palpable that some beast of huge dimensions does actually inhabit Loch Ness. Now, I feel like I should point out at this point, there is something to be said for like a belief in these things. You know, it's nice to believe that there's some unsolved mysteries and thing, but it talks about like unimpeachable, like you can't deny the evidence. Like I beg to differ, because like I don't know, I feel I don't personally believe all of these stories. I feel like for many of them there is a grain of truth in it, but it has been so distorted with how many retellings that like the actual like the core, the seed has been lost. I don't know. I feel like it's kind of, I don't know. It's fine for people to believe these things, but saying that the evidence is irrefutable or unimpeachable or anything, like, it just isn't. You know, these are nice stories. It's good. It's good to have folklore and fairy tales. It's good to collect these things, because, you know, they are a part of human history. They are a part. They talk about, you know, who we are, where we come from, but I feel like it is, yeah, no, it's just incorrect to suggest that, you know, we have evidence for all of these things. You know, they're nice stories, but I don't feel like there's a huge amount of valuable information in them. So that's my lukewarm take. All right, let's read a story of Scottish merfolk. This one is just called Merfolk. Oh no, I think this is like an essay on them. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Well, we could read that, I suppose. The Mermaid of Mckay. In the middle of the 18th century, there lived on the banks of a river in the Mckay country a man known as Big Hector. His great delight was to wander along the shores of the bay near his homestead, where this stream flowed into the sea. Among the flotsam and jetsam cast on the beach he could be found, and especially during dark winter nights, when the wind would be howling through the high cliffs, which sent a pang of fear through the hearts of the bravest inhabitants. The stronger the elements of nature, the greater did the desire appeal to Hector to wade among the surf in the house of darkness. Such was his love for this kind of life that he was shunned by many and left alone to his desires. But this did not seem to affect him. He attended to his solitary cow, cooked his own meals, and did not interfere with anybody. When he did speak, his talk was always of the sea and of the strange creatures which dwelt there, but few believed his tales. In this mode of life he continued to live for well over 30 years, until one morning, following one of the greatest storms known within living memory, he surprised his neighbour by his extraordinary activity around his croft. He seemed much happier and more industrious than usual, and it was observed that he seemed to have left off his former habits. He, however, evaded any inquiry into his affair, and it was no small wonder when, within a year of this strange change in his manner, the cries of a young child were heard from the open door of his cottage. Despite such happenings, the inside of his house was out with the gaze of his neighbours. He would not encourage them in any way, nor would he satisfy their curiosity in regards to the cries heard issuing from within. So it was no small wonder when it was whispered from mouth to mouth that Hector had been taken by command of, Sorry, a bit of a weird phrasing. Grammatically correct, but just caught me off guard. So it was no small wonder when it was whispered from mouth to mouth that Hector had been taken command of by the wee folk. His way of life just desired... His way of life just desired that, and what could be expected? What more could he expect? The ways of a child, however, are the same in all ages and in all places. The wonder of what lies outside their home sets them exploring. A passing neighbour, herding his cows along the banks of the river, happened to lift up his head, and on seeing the child, he, like one possessed, left everything and ran towards the village, shouting as he went that Hector had a child. As years rolled on, Hector seldom went along the shores of the bay. The villagers occasionally visited him, and became friendly with his mermaid wife and child, Peter. Peter joined in the life and laughter of the other children of the community, and he was now about 5 years old. It was, however, noticeable that Hector would not allow anyone near the thatch of his cottage. One morning, Hector and his young son went for fuel to the moor. As they rounded the turn of the hill, the mermaid mother came to the door of her home, and her sobs and yearning cries after her son were heard by most of the villagers. An hour or two later, Hector was on his return journey with his son running by his side, when suddenly, letting out a piercing cry, he threw down his creel of peats and hastened towards his croft. A wall of foam could be clearly seen moving towards the open sea, and the music of seals floated over the water. Hector went straight to the thatched roof of his house, took one look, and then rushed inside his cottage. No one was there, and his hidden treasure was gone. The veil of his wife had disappeared. As long as he could hide this from her, she was his, but now she had managed to get possession of it, and had gone back to her ocean castle. Hector dashed along the banks of the river, but the procession heading seaward increased their speed, and all he could hear was the music and the splashing of waters. Broken-hearted and dismayed, he returned to his lonely croft. His son tried to console him, but could not do so. The following morning he again went to the river's brink, and there he found a large salmon on its bank. This followed morning after morning. One night he kept watch, and sure enough the old seal came up the river with a salmon in its mouth, which it laid on the water's edge. Peter grew up to be a very fine young man and married. No one knew so much about the sea and its ways as he did, likewise the generations which followed him. That was quite good. Had a bit of a twist in the middle. Actually, let's read over the introduction, the essay about mermaids. I'm going to take a sip of water first. The merfolk were the traditional inhabitants of the sea. There are few accounts of mermen, but Highland and Island lore teems with allusions to the mermaids, who dwelt fathoms deep beneath the waves, stringing beads of glistening pearl, and who often came up from the sea caves to disport themselves on the shore, and were to be seen in the quiet bays, floating on the surface of the water and mingling their voices with the sighing breeze. To this day, belief in merfolk, the traditional inhabitants of the... Sorry, I just tripped over my tongue there. To this day, belief in merfolk, the traditional inhabitants of the briny deep, is rife, especially in the northwest coastal districts of Sutherland. Mermen are known by their red caps, which they wear, hence the term Bodach-kappen Yadok, when they disport themselves. No, that's that word again. Disport. I'd never heard it before today, but there we are. When they disport themselves amid the breakers, while mermaids, on the other hand, are said on occasion to come up from the sea caves to recline on the shore in quiet bays, and are recognised by their reddish-yellow curly hair, with wreaths of seaweed round their necks and shoulders. They are believed to mingle their voices with the sighing breeze, but these mermen are said to fight savagely if entangled in fish nets, and unless instantly released cast death spells upon the neighbourhood. During August 1949, mermen were sighted off Craig Moor, in the parish of Kinlochbervie, by several crofters and sailors on more than one occasion. In the superstitious belief of the north, seals held a far higher place than any of the lower animals. They were believed to have a mysterious connection with the human race, and to have the power of assuming human form and faculties. Seals occasionally lift themselves perpendicularly out of the water, exposing half their bodies, and look as like the representation of a mermaid as possible. The wild and mournful cry of a seal is difficult to describe, something between the mew of a cat and the howl of a dog in distress, a weird and unpleasant sound which harmonises with the wild scenery of their surroundings. Highlanders are by no means prepossessed in favour of the good looks of a seal, or shalch, as they term it. Shalch is an expression of disgust, which, when uttered by one crofter to another, is considered a great insult and a climax to every known term of reproach. In Loch Ness, seals are said to be fallen angels, and a popular saying in the north is they are... Sorry, my Gaelic is very rusty. Clownry for Yesiv, king's children under enchantments. Their origin is explained as follows. The widowed king of Loch Ness married for a second time a lady skilled in the black art, who by its means strove to get rid of her stepchildren. It took her 7 years and 7 days to perfect a plan, and at the end of that time she put the royal children under a powerful guess. by which they were transformed into seals, neither fish nor flesh. When at sea they would yearn for the land, and when on land they would yearn for the sea as long as the waves beat upon the shore. They are allowed to resume their original form 3 times a year at full moon. There is a sect in North Uist, known as Clownis Codrum Nanron, the Macodrums of the seals, who are said to be descendants of these enchanted seals. It was considered for a long time to be most unlucky and nothing short of murder to kill a seal, and many tales are told of the fate that befell any brave enough to perform the dire deed. Misfortune was said to dog the footsteps of such a man till the day he died, like the punishment of Coleridge's ancient mariner who shot the sacred albatross. Let's pick another one. Do we feel like a slightly longer one or a slightly shorter one? Let's pick a story from the last chapter. Oh no, there's 2 more chapters. There's the Highland Vision and Miscellaneous Tales. So let's find a Highland Vision. We had one called Phantom Card Players. Wonder if they were playing Magic the Gathering. It was the custom in the old days that, when the chief of a clan went from home, his castle was guarded every night by some of his adherents, who took that duty by turns. This practice originated in the days when there was a danger of a sudden attack by night, but in later and more peaceable times it became a mere formality, and usually only one gentleman kept watch, bringing an attendant or 2 with him. The scene of the vigil was always at the great hall of the castle. One February night, a gentleman entered the hall of the castle in the North Highlands to keep vigil for his absent chief. He brought with him one servant, a mere youth, who had a considerable reputation as a seer. They were supposed to take it in turns to sleep, and the master, after watching till midnight, delegated his vigil to his servant. The youth was interested in the novelty of the scene around him, and was examining some of the family pictures on the walls, when he was amazed to see the great folding doors suddenly thrown open, and 2 footmen in the family livery entered with lights. They were followed by members of the family who had been dead for years, and whose wan and ghastly visages had no resemblance to earthly inhabitants. Card tables were brought, and the ghostly company sat down to play. They conversed with each other as they played, but, although the lad could see their lips moving, there was no sound of voices. He recognised in one of the footmen a relative of his own, who in his lifetime had served the chief. At dawn, the shadowy troop returned the way they had come, and as they passed the youthful watcher, the man who had been his relative in life turned and beckoned to him. At that moment his master wakened, and the poor visionary begged to be carried home, being quite unable by his own efforts to move from the spot where he stood. This was done, and the lad called his friends round him, and related all that had happened, adding that the hand of death was upon him, and that nothing could save him. He died 3 days afterwards. Oh, that's a bit unfair. What did he do? Wah. Poor kid. All the ones in this chapter are a little bit short, so I think I'll do another one from here. There's one that caught my eye called A Dead Man Shot by an Arrow. Yeah, I'm not proud that I'm a little bit morbid, but oops. Martin, the historian of the Western Isles, records the following instance of second sight, as related to him by Sir Norman MacLeod of Bernary. There was a man in Harris, who was always being seen by those with second sight with an arrow in his thigh, and the islanders believed he would meet his death by being shot in some conflict. In course of time, however, the man died a natural death. His body was brought up for burial to St. Clement's Church at Rodale, and at the same time another funeral party arrived with another body to be buried in the same church. An argument arose as to which party should enter the church first. A general melee followed, and someone let fly several arrows. When Sir Norman MacLeod of Bernery, who was present, at last succeeded in persuading them to stop, it was discovered that an arrow had pierced the thigh of the dead man as he lay on the bier, waiting for burial. Thus were the seer's predictions fulfilled. Okay. Alright, let's read a miscellaneous tale, shall we? Oh, let's have a look. This one's a little bit longer. We'll take this one. The Black Officer of Balachron. About the year 1700, the old farmhouse of Balachron near Kingassy was the home of a certain Captain John Macpherson, known as the Black Officer. Captain Macpherson, a zealous recruiting officer, was also believed by many people of the district at that time to be an agent of the devil, and belief was strengthened on account of an incident in the lonely bothy of Gaelic. The Black Officer, a keen sportsman, had invited a number of people to join him in a hunting expedition to Gaelic on Christmas Day. The place of meeting was arranged to be the house of the Postban, near Altlarry. But when the appointed time for the meeting arrived, none appeared but the Postban, who was a letter carrier, and consequently a dependent of the Black Officer. When the captain arrived and saw that none of his guests had turned up, he was very annoyed, but the Postban merely suggested postponing the expedition until the following day. The captain swore and said that he would not postpone it, as he had an appointment to be in Gaelic that night. There was no help for it. The two huntsmen set off, taking with them their guns, 2 dogs, and some provisions, and arrived at the bothy very late that night. A good fire was soon kindled and a meal prepared, but during all this time the captain was restless, and kept on drinking a large quantity of whisky. Towards midnight, the dogs became restless also, and began to growl, and so the captain tied them to the bedpost and ordered the postman to go to sleep. The post complied by wrapping himself in his plaid and stretching himself on his heather bed, but the Black Officer continued his restless pacing to and fro. Suddenly, a knock sounded at the door, and the captain immediately started trembling, and the dogs strained at the leash and growled fiercely. The postman sprang from his bed and made to the open door, but the captain waved him back, and told him that he would open the door himself. As the door opened, the postman caught sight of a tall, dark figure, but was unable to see whether the caller was man or woman. The captain went out quickly, closing the door behind him, and the postman set himself to listen, but all he could hear was the murmur of angry voices, and when the caller was leaving, the postman heard the captain say that he would be at the same spot a year from that night, and that he would bring a number of persons with him. When the captain re-entered the bothy, he was pale and trembling, and made straight for the whisky flask, from which he took a good pull, before telling the postman that his late visitor was a gentleman he had invited to hunt, who was disappointed that the guests did not turn up, and went home. The postman asked the captain if the visitor had far to go, and was informed that he had a fair distance, but that he had a fleet horse which would soon take him home. When daylight came, this postman examined the ground for the marks of the horse's hoofs, but failed to find any. On arriving home, he told his wife and friends what he saw and heard, and all who heard his story were convinced that the Black Officer was under the influence of the devil. A year passed, and as Christmas was once more drawing near, it became known that Captain Macpherson intended to arrange another hunting expedition to Gaelic. Many of the people who had been invited the previous year temporarily left the country, while others feigned illness. The postman, however, had an adventurous son who rejected the warnings of his father and mother and joined the hunting party. This son was said to be under the evil spell of the Black Officer. The Black Officer left Balachron for Gaelic the evening before Christmas with 4 companions and some dogs. The postman's son and a few more of the party were to follow later. As the postman's son and his followers approached Buidebeg, both sides of Ban's brogues came away from the uppers, leaving him barefooted, and consequently it was impossible for young Ban to go any further, and his followers, at once giving way to superstitious fear, decided to abandon the journey also. In the meantime, the Black Officer and his party were well on the way to Gaelic. That night a fearful storm swept over Badenoch, and continued throughout the following day. The relatives of the Black Officer's companions began to get very anxious for their safety, and fear began to spread throughout the countryside, when it became generally known what the postman had experienced the previous year. Various methods were tried to ascertain the fate of the hunting party, but without result, until at last someone devised the following superstitious method of obtaining the information. The youngest member of the family was placed on what was called a goggin, and then questioned for the information required. The powers of the child were supposed to be governed by some supernatural power, and the answers were firmly believed by the people. The following day, a search party headed by an old soldier and was organised. Let's try that one again. The following day, a search party headed by an old soldier was organised and proceeded to Gaelic. On reaching the bothy at Gaelic, the search party found it to be in ruins, the greater part of it having been swept away. On entering the bothy, they found 2 bodies lying stiff in the bed, while on the floor was another in a crouching position, with one stocking on and the other clasped in his hand. Near the door lay the body of Captain Macpherson, and behind him lay the carcasses of the dogs and the bodies of 3 others belonging to the party. This accounted for all but one of the black officers' party, and after a further search the body was found lying face downwards at some considerable distance from the bothy. The bodies were then placed on crude stretchers, and the search party then proceeded homewards carrying the remains. They had not gone far, however, when a violent storm arose, compelling them to take shelter. The old soldier leading them told them to place the body of the black officer behind, and when this was done, the storm suddenly ceased, and the procession carried on home. Ooh, spooky. Oop. Quite like that one. It's another one of those sort of, although it's quite long, it's another one of those less is more kind of thing. Nothing's really explained, which are the stories that I quite like. Alright. Oh, time for another sip of water. Alright, let's go back to the beginning, see what else we got. I think I'll read another couple from this book, and then I've got another book just sitting to my side, which I'll go through after this. Yeah. We'll read one short one from each section. Now that I'm sort of in the groove of it. I want to read... Wait. Okay. That'll be one. And... Okay, we'll go for this one. This one is called The Changeling of Yes Naby. Trow take thee was till within recent years a common saying in the Northern Isles. It arose from the belief that the trows. I'm gonna struggle with this word actually. TROW. It's sort of the Scottish word for a troll. Troll. I think as long as I'm consistent, it doesn't super matter, right? Trow. We'll go for trow. A farmer at Yes Naby had an infant son who fell sick and became very sick. Oh, sorry, I didn't even finish that. It arose from the belief that the trows were formerly in the habit of stealing children and substituting sickly offspring of their own. A farmer at Yes Naby had an infant son who fell sick and became very seriously ill. A local wise woman was called in, and after looking intently at the sick child, informed the parent that this was no child of theirs but a croupin, or changeling bought by the trows. She gave them certain directions which they promised faithfully to carry out. At a certain hour on the following night, she said the croupin would be in great distress, but they were to disregard its cries entirely, and were to keep something burning in the fire all night. Unless they did this, the spell would be broken. Okay. Unless they did this, the spell would be broken. About midnight, the child was heard to cry piteously, and seemed to be gasping for breath. It became blue in the face, and the father, unable to look unmoved on its suffering, gave it a drink of water. He appealed again to the old woman, who repeated her instructions as before. For the second time, he promised to carry out her directions. But the next night the same thing happened, and unable to resist the agonizing shrieks, he once more supplied the child with a drink of water. The third night he resisted strenuously, as he had great faith in the old woman's powers. When no attention was paid to the cries, the croupen rolled out of its cot onto the floor, and with a piercing shriek disappeared up the chimney in a blue lough or flame. In its place lay the man's own child, sleeping peacefully. This blue lough is referred to frequently by Ossian, and seems to have been a belief common to both Celtic and Norse folklore. Ah, there we are. There's something we knew. Oh, hey. Thank you, Lyra Silcarel, for following. Very good to have you here. Yeah, so I don't know if any of you have seen Hilda on Netflix. Great little animated series. It's paganism for kids. No, it's really good. How to explain it? It's like an adventurous young girl gets into all sorts of supernatural scrapes, but it's very safe. Like, you know everything's going to be all right. It's really beautiful as well. Has a great color palette. The animation's lovely. So yeah, if you're looking for something to watch and you're enjoying some of these stories, I would say go check out Hilda, and yeah, go read Hilda. Go watch Hilda. It is also a graphic novel, but I haven't read those. I've only watched the series. All right. The next one we're going to do is The Red Hanging Judge. Many years ago, a supreme magistrate named Ambrev Ruach of the Hebrides earned the local title of the Red Hanging Judge on account of the ruthless and vindictive sentences which he frequently imposed. The penalties he passed were so cruel that he was ultimately compelled to flee from Lewis to shelter in northwest Scotland. There he lived in seclusion for some time with an old woman in a lonely croft on the hillside overlooking Inverkirk Bay, but his whereabouts were ultimately discovered by a Lewisman named Askig, who tracked him to the banks of the remote loch in Rossshire, where he stabbed the judge to death. On account of this incident, the loch inherited the name of Loch Scian Askig, modern spelling Shinskig, Loch of Askig's Knife. The murderer trailed the judge's body some miles distant over rough country and dug a grave near a croft at Inverkirk on the coast road between Loch Inver and Ullapool, marked by a long flat slab of reddish stone to this day. Some time after the murder, Askig's dead body was found in a loch to the northwest of Balachron by the road to why are place names so hard? Achel Tibuy. This loch was named Loch Oskig after him by his friends and still retains the name. Less than half a century ago, at time of writing. I think this book is like 40 years old, 50 years old. Oh wow, no, okay, 1961 this book was published. Less than half a century ago, a Canadian relative of the present tenant of the croft, while on holiday at Inverkirk, raised the slab of stone one autumn afternoon and found underneath a number of beautiful pebbles. He collected a few of them and placed them on his bedroom mantelpiece in an upper room of the cottage. That very same night a violent thunderstorm occurred, waking all the inhabitants of the neighbourhood. One peal of thunder alone is said to have reverberated amid the hills for over an hour, and to this day the event is referred to locally as the Night of the Storm. The croft shook and vibrated, the bed swayed to and fro, and the windows and doors rattled. Suddenly, at the height of the storm, the crofter's brother and his wife, as they sat up in bed, beheld a bluish-green light on the mantelshelf where the pebbles lay. In a frenzy of bewilderment and fear, the crofter's brother leapt out of bed, and seizing hold of his trophies, threw them seaward out of the window. No sooner had he done so than the storm subsided, and a great calm reigned. In the morning, a search was made for the pebbles, but not a single one could be found. According to local tradition, the judge resented the interference with his grave and his earthly belongings. Can it be that they are once again beneath the slab marking the lonely grave of Inverkirk? Ooh, could they indeed? Okay, so that was another ghost story one. Oh, there's one here just called The Evil House. Do you want to read a story about an evil house? Or it could be The Evil House. The evil house. Like, is the house itself evil? Or is it a house in which evil dwells? Now, we've already done a haunted house story. Let's move on to the next section. Number 3, Witchcraft. Are there any tutorials? Any like information on how to? Oh yeah, here's one just called How to Raise the Wind. Let's read this one. Cast ourselves a spell. A fisherman in the far northwest of Scotland told me about a strange way of raising the wind, believed in chiefly by the people of the Western Islands, and which Caithness fishermen do not like, as it affects their catch of herring. It seems that when the men leave the lews for the Caithness fishing in July, some of the women left at home put a number of knots on a woolen thread. Towards the end of the fishing, or earlier if they are not successful, they undo these knots one by one, with the result that the wind begins to rise, and the boats not being able to get to the sea. Towards the end of the fishing, or earlier if they are not successful, they undo these knots one by one, with the result that the wind begins to rise, and the boats not being able to get to sea, the hired hands, the hired hands are sent home. They take care not to undo the knots at too great a rate, lest the wind should arise too suddenly, for the loss of the loved ones might in this way be brought about if they happened to be at sea when the last knot is being undone. A shorter way of making the weather stormy is to draw the cat through the fire, though just how it came to be, supposed the poor beast's suffering could influence the weather, would be interesting to know. Sorry, some of those sentences were kind of difficult. I am a native English speaker, I swear. Just how it came to be supposed the poor beast's suffering could influence the weather would be interesting to know. Interesting construction. Let's see. Monsters. What kind of monster do we want to read? Let's read this one. This one's called Croch na Croiv. Nearly 800 years ago, a terrible scourge fell upon the fertile valley of the Castley in Sutherland. A fierce monster had taken up its abode in a hole on the east side of a hill in the vicinity, and no living thing was safe from its fury. In shape, the monster was like a huge worm, and if it had ventured out into the open, people might have learned how to avoid it, for worms are not, as a rule, noted for their speed of movement. But this monster's power lay in its venomous breath, which poisoned all that came within reach of its rapacious jaws. As a rule, the worm lay hidden in its hole, breathing out noxious vapour like the smoke from a volcano. So powerful was its breath that it hung over the countryside for miles, bringing certain destruction to all living things. The valley soon became desolate, and the people of the district fled from their houses. At intervals, the worm left its lair and crawled slowly to the summit of the hill, winding its sinuous length round, and on these occasions it used to lie as if surveying the scene of desolation round about with the greatest satisfaction. The hole in which the monster lived came to be called Tol na Croiv, the worm's hole, and the hill round which it coiled, itself Croch na Croiv. William the Lion, King of Scotland, heard of the misfortune which had befallen this part of his realm, and offered a large reward to anyone who would slay the monster, but none of his knights was brave enough to attempt such a perilous task, and when no one came to their rescue, the country folk lost heart, for it seemed as though they would have to go on living in fear all their lives. At last, a rough and ready farmer from the Kyle of Sutherland, Hector Gunn by name, came forward and said that although he was a plain man, he would try to slay the beast and rid the countryside of it for good and all. He mounted his horse and rode till he came to within a few miles of Crocknacrive. He asked the people where the worm's hole was, but they answered that the monster was not in the hole that day, but had crawled up the side of the hill and lay sunning itself on top, as if like Angiavel, the evil one. He thought that all the world was his. The farmer then wheeled his horse round and rode straight for the hill. He had with him a broadsword with which to sever the creature's head, but he soon found that this would not avail him at all, for before he came near the foot of the hill he felt the worm's poisonous breath coming towards him in waves of fetid heat, and became so weak and faint that he could go no further. He returned crestfallen to where the people were waiting for him, and great were their lamentations on seeing his dejected mien, for he had gone out full of confidence that he would deliver them from the scourge. It is a good thing that the worm was asleep, they said, or else Hector Gunn would have been utterly consumed. Hector Gunn did not intend to allow himself to be beaten by a worm, not even by one with such unearthly powers as this. When he had recovered somewhat from his faintness, he borrowed a 7 ell long spear, and asked the astonished villagers if they had any pitch. They said that they had, and he ordered them to boil some of it in a pot. He then went on to the moor and cut a great divot of peat. He thrust the end of the long spear through the peat, and dipped it in the boiling pitch. With this strange weapon in hand, he mounted his horse once more and rode towards Crocknacrive. The country people followed at a distance, wondering. As soon as Hector Gunn came near the monster, and it opened its mouth to suck him in with its poisonous breath, he held out the spear with the reeking peat at the end, and the wind blew the fumes right into the worm's face. So strange and pungent was the smoke that the creature was almost suffocated, and drew its breath and wound itself tighter and tighter round the hill in its agony. Hector rode nearer and nearer, till he was on a level with the monster. Then, with one quick movement, he thrust the burning peat down its throat, and held it there until the fearsome creature died. Thus was the Valley of Castley delivered from the worm, and William the Lion rewarded Hector Gunn with gifts of land and money. And to this day, men may go to Crocknacrive and see traces of this old story in the spiral indentations said to have been made on this hillside by the worm in its coils, as its coils tightened in its death throes. That was quite a nice one. I think I've heard a version of that before, but it was I don't know. It seems like it might be a common one. Let's find another mermaid one. This one's called The Mermaid of Kessick, a legend from the Black Isle. A man named Patterson was once walking along the shore near Kessick Ferry when he saw Nasui Erin Aikin Gorcha. When he saw, sitting on the dark misty deep, a mermaid, whom he tried to detain by wading into the water and pulling some of the scales from her tail, in obedience to the old belief that if even part of her fishtail was removed, a mermaid was compelled to assume human form. Before his eyes the transformation took place, and the sea maiden stood up before him, tall and fair. She had long silky hair that was yellow as gold and soft as the curling foam of the sea. Her eyes were wide and clear and blue as the sky, her lips red as winter berries and as tempting as fruits of summer, and in place of the fishtail she had slim white feet. Patterson fell desperately in love with the sea maiden and took her home as his bride. The scales he carefully hid in an outhouse. He lived in a cottage by the shore, and the raging noise of the waves, which sounded night and day at the foot of the cottage garden, filled his mermaid bride with longing to return to her home in the land under the waves, where she had been nursed by the ocean and rocked by the storms. She used to plead with her husband to let her go, promising that if he did so, their family would always be blessed with a plentiful supply of fish, and that no members of it would ever be drowned at Kessick Ferry. But he remained adamant. One day, one of the children, named Kenneth, discovered the scales in the outhouse and took them to his mother, who straightway made for the shore and became a mermaid again. Not since that day has the Mermaid of Kessick been seen, but there are still local people who firmly believe in her existence and declare that she still watches over her descendants and keeps them from peril at sea. One of the things I was a bit worried about with like a lot of the mermaid stories that I've heard from Scotland, also Selkie stories, are very similar. We're going to skip chapter 6 because I think it's just about the sixth sense, the Highland vision. I see dead people. And the last one's also sad. Boy died. Didn't deserve it. Let's read. Let's read this one. Let's end off with Lure of the Pipes, as told to me by a native of the district. The scene was the heart of Deer Deer Forest in Rossshire. The time was nearing midnight in the late December long ago, when the wee people danced on top of the bogs that even a wild duck could not cross without breaking the surface. Halfway up one of the hills, known as Corrie Glass, stood Big John Clachnacharnich, and beside him were his two famous black dogs. Big John was the head stalker on Deeberdale, and he had been out all day and most of the night after the hinds, which they were shooting off. It had turned out to be a wild night with a half moon, and John had taken shelter for a while against the buffetings of the storm. At last the night cleared a bit, and he started for home. As it was late, he decided to go round the side of the hill and take a shortcut home. He had been that road often before, and knew every step of it, and he could also jump the poacher's pool at Balachron, the dog's burn, and still cut a few more miles off his road. If there was one thing on earth Big John loved besides good whisky, it was the pipes, and as he came near Balachron, he thought he heard bagpipe music. He stopped and listened, and sure enough, there it was, away to his right, and that piper could play. He was playing Bram Castle, and John never heard it played so well before. He could not resist the music, and started to walk towards it. He wondered, as he went along, who the piper could be, and what possessed him to come there and play on a night like that. As he neared the place where the sounds came from, the moon went behind the clouds, and it became very dark. Things seemed to become very still as he walked on, and the sound of the pipes grew louder. The piper was now playing a reel, the finest John ever heard, and through the music he thought he heard hooching. All of a sudden he saw a light, and going nearer he saw a fail-roofed home. John knew that he was not very far by now from the Poacher's Pool and Rory the Glen's Black Bothy, but he could not remember ever seeing this place before. The sound of the pipes drew him on, however, and he went forward to the door. But here a queer thing happened. One of his black dogs, which would tackle the biggest stag in Deeberdale, would not go another step. John stopped and tried to coax her on, but she would not move and lay down. Then John remembered that the dog would not follow her master if the unknown was in front. He was shaken at this, but the lure of the pipes was too great, and he said, "Very well, you can stay here. As long as I have Black Simon with me and Kilshire under my arm, I'll face anything." The piper was now placing Tullochgorum, and what a piper! The time he kept! Just as John went up to the door, it opened, and an old woman said, "Come in, John. I'm sure you will be near starved to death with the cold." John thanked her, and said he would come in for a minute or two and hear the pipes. As he entered the house, he took off his bonnet, and the old woman made to take it from him, but Black Simon, snarling and growling, snatched the bonnet out of his hand and held it in his mouth. The old woman then opened the kitchen door, and the sight that met John he'll never forget. The house was full of men and girls. They were the finest-looking girls he had ever seen. They were nearly all dressed the same, in long frocks of a queer bluish-red colour. The men had greenish-red clothes. John had ears only for the piper, however, and he looked round to see where he was. There he stood, near to the bed-closet door, and behind the spinning wheel to give room to the dancers. John was stunned when he saw the piper. Of all the pipers he had ever seen or heard about, this one was the king. He had on the full Highland dress, but for the life of him, John could not tell the tartan. And the pipes, what pipes, solid gold mounted, and as he played the reel a Tulloch, John thought that he could see the blue sparks flying from his fingers and smoke coming from the chanter. The music stopped, and the piper looked at John and smiled, but never spoke. The only one that spoke of the whole company was the old woman, who then asked if John would take a dram. He said he would, and she gave him a glass of good stuff. If the music was good, the whisky was better. As soon as he took the first sip, he thought his whole body was on fire, right to the soles of his feet. John drained the glass, and then the piper started to play again, a schottische this time. And the best-looking of the girls came towards John, holding out her hand, smiling at him, and silently inviting him to dance. The whiskey had done its work well, and John thought he could manage the dance fine, and was on point of taking the girl in his arms when Black Simon again jumped in front of him. John looked down at the dog, wondering what was wrong with him, and then he saw, peeping from below the girl's long frock, instead of dainty feet, 2 horses' hooves. He drew back, frightened out of his wits, and then, looking towards the closet door where the piper stood, he saw a long red streak coming oozing out from below the door. He knew the company he was in, and also that his end was near, and he shouted, "God help me!" He could not have chosen better words, for all at once he saw the faces change, the piper's tartan turned to red, and over the blowstock of the pipes from which the smoke and sparks emanated, he saw the face of Lucifer himself grinning at him. He took his only chance, and with one bound reached the door and turned to call Black Simon, who had twice that night saved him, and was doing it a third time, for as John sprang for the door, the dog sprang at Nick, and as John turned, he saw Old Horny draw the dirk from its sheath, still wet with the blood of its last victim, and raise it to kill Black Simon. Quick as a flash, John's up with Killsure and let drive with both barrels. But that was all the good it did, for John, who was hardly ever known to miss, saw the lead splash on the wall behind after going harmlessly through Old Nick. John then bolted and ran as hard as he could for the poacher's pool, but fast as he was no match for the one who followed. Looking back, he saw the monster, and on each side of him 2 of the girls, now howling fiends, with flames of fire streaking from their heads in place of the fair hair they had earlier. He could hear the chatter of their horses' hooves as they raced over the rocks and heather. John heard the gurgle of the water of the poacher's pool, and made a last supreme effort to reach it. Better to die in the cool water among the salmon, he thought, than to be torn to bits by fingers of fire. Then, just as Old Nick raised his bloody dirk to strike, across the water at Rory the Glen's, a cock crew in the morning. John fell unconscious on the brink of the pool, and it was hours after, when he came to find his 2 dogs licking his face. "Oh," said he, "Black Simon, I thought that your end came as the dirk fell." But then Black Simon rolled over on his back, and John saw on the dog's breast 4 white hairs, and he knew that the devil was powerless against a black dog as long as he had those hairs. And so, to this day, if you listen to the poacher's pool, you will hear in the running water the sound of the pipes on nights when the wee people dance on the bogs, and the wind blows around Corrie Glass. Here we are. Never knew about that superstition, that the devil has no power over a black dog that has white hair. That's interesting. That's interesting. Sorry about that. Right. It's now 7:30. I think I'll read like 1 or 2 from this book of Icelandic tales. Yeah, just gonna have a dram of water first. Okay, let's see what we've got. We've got elves, we've got trolls, water dwellers, ghosts, buried treasure. Well, this one has how to raise the dead. Could do that one. I do like instructional black magic videos. What are we going to do? Let's finish off with a ghost story. Let's take quite a long one. This one sounds fun. The Bridegroom and the Dead Man. Hopefully it's not too gruesome. Alright. Okay, I'll read this one and then this is your last story of the night. Once there were 4 men digging a grave for some corpse or other, and they say it was in the churchyard at Filar. They were all cheerful fellows, and one of them, a lively young man, was the greatest joker of the lot. When the grave began to be fairly deep, many bones came up in the digging, and among them there was one most remarkably big thigh bone from a man's leg. The digger, who was so fond of a joke, picked up this bone, weighed it in his hand, and measured it against himself, and they do say that when this thigh bone had one end resting on the ground level, on level ground, the other end came up to his hip, and yet he was a full-grown man of average height. Now, as he was doing this, the young man said, as a joke, "Unless I'm much mistaken, this fellow must have been a good wrestler. It would be fun to have him at one's wedding feast in due course." The others took up the idea, but they talked rather less about it than he did, after which the man puts the thigh bone aside with the other bones that had been dug up. There is nothing more to tell of until 5 years later, when this same young man is about to get married, and the banns have been read out twice. Then the girl he is engaged to has a dream 3 nights running, in which she thinks she sees a terrifyingly big man come to her in her sleep, and ask her whether her fiancé remembers now how he jeered at him once a few years ago, and on the third night he adds that they won't be able to avoid having him as a guest at the wedding. The girl took no notice, but she began to feel oppressed in her sleep, especially as the man was so very big. She had said nothing to her fiancé about this dream until she dreamt of the same man 3 times. But then, the next morning, she says to her sweetheart, "Who you mean to ask to our wedding, dear heart?" "I don't know yet, my dear," says he. "I haven't started thinking about it yet. I meant to get the calling of the banns over first." "Then you haven't asked anyone already?" says she. The man says he can't remember doing so, and begins to rack his brains, and he thought it strange that she should be so persistent in questioning him about this after some thought. He says that the long and short of it is that he has not actually asked anybody yet, but that, true enough, a few years before he had once said as a joke about a thigh bone that had come up out of a grave that it would be fun to have such a tall man at one's wedding feast in due course, but he could not recall asking anyone else apart from that. At this, his fiancée looked rather grave and said that that was not the sort of joke one ought to make, least of all about the bones of the dead. "And now I had better tell you," says she, "that the man you jeered at like that has quite made up his mind to come to our wedding feast." Then she told him all about her dreams and what words the big man had spoken the night before. Her sweetheart was rather alarmed, and says that she had certainly spoken a true word in saying that jokes of that sort were best left unsaid. Then he goes off to sleep as usual the evening, but during the night he thinks he sees coming towards him a terrifyingly huge man, like a giant, all frowning and scowling, who, he thinks, asks him whether he means to keep his promise given 5 years before and have him as a guest at the wedding. The man was shaking with fear, but he said that so it must be. The other answered that he could not get out of it, like it or not, and that he need never have sneered at his bones, and that he was going to suffer for it now. After that, the ghost goes off, and the man sleeps on till morning, when he tells his fiancée about his dream and begs her to give him some advice. She said that he must get hold of some timber and a builder, and have him quickly build an outhouse which would match this man's size, by what they had seen of it both in their dreams, so that he would be able to stand upright in it, and the inside must be long and as broad as its height, to the level of the crossbeam. Also, he must have this outhouse decked out with hangings, just as it is the custom to deck a bridal hall, and there he must lay a table for this guest on his own, with a white tablecloth on it, and set before him some churchyard mould in a dish, and some water in a flask, for he would take no other food, and set a chair by the table, and have a bed in the outhouse too, in case the man wished to rest, and he must have 3 candles on the table beside him. The bridegroom must escort him to this place, but must take great care not to walk ahead of him, nor to stand under the same roof with him, nor should he agree to any request or offer of his, whatever he might suggest, and he should talk to him as little as possible, but lock the shed and leave him as soon as he had offered him everything what was set on the table. So now the bridegroom has everything done, as the bride had stipulated, an outhouse built, standing on its own, and of a suitable size, and everything set out in it, just as had been said. Now time wears on to the day of the wedding feast, and the marriage service is held in the usual way. Next, everybody sat down for the feasting, and in the same way that they all got up from the table later on. Next, everybody sat down for the feasting, and in the same way they all got up from the table later on, when it had got quite dark, and still nothing had happened. After this, people were moving about the room, some drinking, some chatting, but the bridal pair were sitting quietly, as is the custom. Then there comes a mighty knock at the door, and nobody is in a hurry to open it. The bride nudges the groom, but he turns quite pale. A little time goes by, and then there comes another single knock, a far heavier one. Then the bride takes the groom by the hand and leads him to the door, much against his will, and opens it. They both see a monstrously tall man standing there, and he says he has come to sit at their wedding feast. So the bride pushes the groom out to go and welcome his guest, praying that God give him strength, and she herself goes back in. As for the groom, he goes off with this man to the outbuilding he has built for him and ushers him into it. The stranger wants him to walk in ahead of him, but this he will not do. So in the end, the other goes in first, and as he does, he says, "Another time you'll take good care not to sneer at dead men's bones." The bridegroom pretends not to have heard, and says that he hopes the other will enjoy what has been laid ready for him, and not be angry with him for not being able to stay with him. The stranger urges the bridegroom to come in there with him all the same, even if only for a moment, but he will not do so, not on any account. Then the dead man says, "Even if you can't stay beside me this time, nor even come inside the same building as me, I suppose you will do one thing for me, come and visit me in return." But this the bridegroom flatly refused, and so slams the door and locks it. Then he goes back to the bridal party, where everything was pretty quiet, for everyone had been reduced to silence by what had happened. Only the bride still behaved cheerfully. After this, the guests took themselves off little by little, and the young couple settled down for the night, and they slept till morning. Next morning, the young husband wanted to go and see what had become of his latest guest of the evening before, but the bride said he must not take so much as a single step in that direction unless she comes with him. So they both of them go to the outhouse, she going ahead to open the door. The guest has quite gone, and he has finished the water in the flask, but has scattered the earth from the dish all over the floor. "I thought as much," said the woman. "If you had gone in this building without me, and if you had put one foot in this earth, you would have passed into the ghost's power, and would never have returned to the world of men. But it won't hurt me, even if I do step in it, and so I'll sweep and scrub the building." But other people say that as the ghost was leaving, he went to the door of the room where the feasters were, or to that of the room where the young couple were feasting, and spoke this verse: "There's no thanks from your guest, for nothing did I taste but water plain and cold to mix with churchyard mould." He never visited the young couple again, and they loved one another long and dearly. Ah. That's a bit of an interesting story. I don't really feel like it was particularly cruel for the... well, I suppose you shouldn't really disturb the bones of the dead. Well, I think that'll be it for the evening. Thank you for joining me. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've learned something. I certainly had a lot of fun. I'll probably continue next Wednesday, but I'll decide on something to read ahead of time and do a sort of more of a read-along kind of thing. But yeah, thanks for joining me. I hope you'll see me on Friday when I'll be continuing with Sakana. And yeah, until then, rather, I just hope you have a good evening. So, ta-ta for now.